I think I spelled it right. Did I? Did I do okay? Hey, Pragma. Buongiorno. Uh, I'm Sebastiaan with. You may know me just from my avatar. I go by SDW in a lot of places. Um, I'm a visual designer. I run a little design shop in San Francisco called Pictogram, and we focus mostly on designing icons and user interfaces for apps, but also sometimes branding and typography, that kind of stuff. In my spare time, I like riding motorcycles to very far away places and dabble in photography a bit. I'm also Dutch. So originally, I'm actually from Holland, and I moved to San Francisco about 8 years ago. And I'm not from like Amsterdam or a big city. I'm actually from a really small town. It's about the size of Verona. It's called, and this is a bit of a bad word. It sounds like you're clearing your throat. It's called Groningen. It's like up way in the north of Holland. It's a really cool town with a lot of history, kind of like Verona. Not anything as cool as Romeo and Juliet, but a really rich history, especially of visual design and typography. In fact, one of my greatest design heroes is from my hometown. Not just because he is from my hometown. He does a lot of really cool stuff. He did this crazy typeface called New Alphabet. He's done a lot of like really crazy futuristic typography stuff. And yeah, I've like always really admired him. His name is Wim CROUWEL. This is what he looks like. It's like, can you see that he was a big design guy in the 80s by this photo? I don't know. Like, we have a lot in common, me and Wim. We're both from this small town in Holland that like nobody's from. We both have a really deep-rooted passion for typography. That's also kind of where the similarities end. You know, Wim is like clearly a total badass. I am not. He is known for like his lasting impact on like modern typography and graphic design, and I'm mostly famous for this like UI UX joke I made once when there was a Speedo cap on like a watermelon. In fact, I was at a conference like this once, and someone came up to me and was like, "Hey, aren't you the guy who tweeted like the watermelon Speedo cap thing?" And I was like, "Yeah, I guess that's my epitaph. That'll probably be on my gravestone at some point." You know, probably in Comic Sans, because that's how those things work. Anyway, I want to talk a little bit about the design of the camera app I've been working on. But before I get into that, I kind of want to talk a little bit about success and failure, two really interesting things. No doubt everybody here has seen a presentation about success. Everybody loves talking about success. It's always like dressed up really nice, and there's all these TED Talks, and they're really inspiring, and all these success stories and stuff. But whenever, like at some point, I kind of got a little fed up with them, because a lot of them kind of involve this unhealthy portion of luck, and they become a little bit anecdotal and not that instructional anymore. On the other hand, success stories are really nice to do presentations on because A, it makes you feel good, B, there's a lot of stock imagery for them. So, you know, you're in a time crunch, you gotta do a presentation, you gotta go to Italy, lots of traveling and stuff. What are you gonna do? Stock photos. Seriously. This is only scratching the surface. It gets much better from here. So, for instance, this is like appeals more to like the business people among us. Maybe the people who work in the corporate life can appreciate this. This man is representing success here. The guy who built the staircase clearly did not. It's very shoddy, really, especially by Italian architectural standards. I guess this is exactly where you end up eventually. Like you get further into it, it gets a bit more like ethereal and much more conceptual. You have to appreciate them for that. And at this point, I found this and I was like, this is it. Like it doesn't get any better than that. It's amazing. Can anyone name the computer? What is it? Very good. That old one. Real Mac. And I mean, there's even video. It's amazing. This stuff can fill an entire presentation. Great stuff. No, really, those things would make it deck kind of boring. What would also make it boring is the story. You know, it's, for some reason, Keynote ruined my pretty animation here. I much prefer the stories where you eventually maybe get to the success or not at all, but you look at these really interesting. I've got a laser pointer. You look at these really interesting curves, especially the ones where you kind of took the wrong turn and you're like, oh god, that was not good. It makes for a really interesting story. So let's flip that around. If you talk about failure for a second, right? This is a great moment to take a photo of me standing in front of this because it's really representative of like me. It's like, failure. Still better than that gravestone. So failure is interesting because not a lot of people do presentations about it, right? It's embarrassing. You don't really want to relive those kind of moments. And, of course, worst of all, there's not a lot of good stock photos for them. But failure is interesting. It is deeply, deeply interesting. In fact, everybody always says, you know, you got to fall and get up and, like, learn from it and stuff. Like, take, for instance, Walt Disney. Walt Disney is brilliant. We can all agree he's a super creative guy. When he was working his little job, when he was not like the great Walt Disney we know today, when he's just Joe Everyman, everyday Walt Disney, he was working as an illustrator for this small newspaper called the Kansas City Star. And they laid him off. And they kicked him off, not because he was too creative or like he had all these big aspirations. No, he just got fired for lack of creativity. That's not the Walt Disney we know today. I mean, did they make a mistake, the Kansas City Star? No, probably not. They probably had a really good reason to fire him. But the fact of the matter is, we know the success of Walt Disney, but there's a lot of failures that happened to make that success happen. Like those were the formative failures of Walt. Those things probably taught him something and perhaps like lit a fire under his ass to be more creative. Who knows? He today, obviously super creative. He's since passed on, but ABC ended up owning the Kansas City Star. Walt Disney bought ABC, so in the end, he got his way. Anyway, I'd like to talk about 3 of my failures, which are always interesting to dig into. Number 1 for me was school. Never been great at school. If you want to summarize my sort of career in school, I would summarize it with 2 words, and that's dropping out. Never been very good at actually being at school. I was sort of the perennial dropout. It's not because I dropped out of high school, not because I hated the classes or the people. Quite enjoyed it. Didn't make really bad grades, but it was because I was kind of smoking a lot of weed. And I was kind of a little jerk. And the little jerk thing, I feel you have to supplement some evidence, right? I can't just take anyone in the hall here and say like, hey, you're a jerk. You gotta actually present some evidence. So Exhibit A looks kind of like a jerk. Oh, definitely a jerk. Yeah. Never. This T-shirt says witchcraft is legal. Never take legal advice from a T-shirt. Just a no-brainer. Yeah, and then the whole work ethic is summarized in this photo. So at this point, several words are going through your mind. What was I doing? Instead of being in school, I was actually using a lot of Photoshop and kind of dabbling in it and like playing with it. And it was getting to such a point where my friends would be like, hey, we're playing a round of Quake. Do you want to like join and hop in and play some Quake? And I was like, no, I'm Photoshopping. And they're like, well, what are you doing in Photoshop? Sounds cool, but like, what are you making? I was like, I don't know, like balls? Like, this is rendered in Bryce 3D, by the way. Anyone here use Bryce? Bryce? Yeah, look at that. There's dozens of us, literally dozens. It got progressively weirder. I let the 3D slide, and now I'm making, like, I don't know, a city on a lettuce? There's a coyote in there. There's some topography. Stuff is happening. To this point, like, I don't even know. How do you describe this to someone, right? Like, there's fruit. I think there's a watermelon birthing a cantaloupe melon. There's a jet fighter in there somewhere. But what you will notice is that I'm getting really good at cutting out these palm trees. So I was learning Photoshop kind of by using it. Now, obviously, these things are still online somewhere, like just taking up precious kilobytes. They're totally useless. Was it a failure? Yes, it was definitely a failure. Like, I dropped out of school. That was pretty bad. But I learned a lot of Photoshop, and that came in useful when into art school, where most dropouts go. So to go to art school, I was like, I need a laptop now. So I got my first laptop. When the Intel MacBook Pro was announced, I was like, yes, this is it. This is awesome. So my parents helped me out a little bit financially to buy one, seeing it as an investment in my future. And I find myself not playing games or like fiddling with anything, but just doing menial tasks and finding great satisfaction in it. And I'm sure we've all had this feeling when we first interacted with macOS, and it was like, wow, this is intensely satisfying and intuitive and really cool. And I was wondering, like, what makes it tick? Why is this so satisfying? Why can I figure everything out? Like, what is this user interface thing? And I decided to kind of start applying my skills to kind of see if I could do something similar to that, or at least sort of enhance it even more. At the time, there was an icon in the dock for preview. This is the leopard version of it. I couldn't find the one that shipped with tiger, which was on my laptop. It had a really creepy kid in it, like demon eyes. And I was like, whoa. So this is the first icon I designed. I made it in Photoshop as a replacement for preview, and I used all those wacky palm tree cutout stuff. You can see I couldn't quite get over the lack of vegetation, so I put a leaf in there. I made my first icon, and I actually really enjoyed it. I thought it was really fun, way more fun than making those wacky prints. And I kept making little icons just for fun while in art school. This is one of the icon sets I did. It was free. Back then you could customize icons on your map. No system integrity protection getting in the way, and you could actually change the binary of an app file, and the system was like, whatever, it's all good. Funny enough, this actually got me some really good SEO in the sense that the name of the icon pack was War on Bad Design Icon Set. Quite a mouthful. #1 on Google for bad icon design. Yes, very good. So I made stuff like this, and unfortunately he's not here anymore, but one of the attendees at the conference is actually my first client, and he approached me, Duncan, and he said, hey, I'm making an app for Mac. I need an icon for it. Will you make it for me? And I was like, yeah, wow, people will pay me for this stuff? Sure. Cool. Okay, so I made my first Mac icon. As you can see, I didn't quite let go of the trees yet. I was like, you'll take these from my cold, dead hands. So there's still a few trees and flowers and stuff in it. But yeah, my first icon was a fact. And I started working with more indie Mac developers back then to make icons. And that became my sort of side gig. I also made an app for the iPod. Anyone here remember iPod software? You couldn't actually make iPod software. You needed to have like access to the SDK, and obviously the stoner bozo from Holland was not getting access to the SDK from Apple. So what happened here? Okay, so here's the deal. I found out that if you sync an album of photos with iPhoto to your iPod, it's just a series of photos, and it assumes alphabetic order and puts them in that order or the capture date, depending on how you sort the iPhoto album. There's no transition if you scroll between them on your iPod. So what I just did is in Photoshop, I made a couple images like this, sequentially, so you could scroll through time zones. It kind of looked like an app that was really responsive. It was kind of neat. And mind you, I sold it because people could send me an email and say like, hey, my time zone is Verona. That'll be the starting time zone. You could scroll back and forth through it, and there was these wicked themes. Like, look at the hacker theme up there. I called this one Firewalk. I did that. And it was such a success, I made the money I spent on an iPod Nano back. Like, I sold like maybe 100 licenses somehow. And it was a real success because it actually got this clicker. It got pirated. I don't know, like, there's no DRM on it. It's just a set of images. So someone uploaded their version to FTP Army or something. Yeah, interesting. But now you're going like, so what about the whole school thing? Well, I was still in art school, but spending all my time doing all this Mackie stuff, like making little iPod apps and icons and that kind of stuff. And eventually, through word of mouth and doing a lot of icon work for people, I got my first big client. I did work for a design agency that was going to do the UI for HP's first, and certainly not last, touchscreen PC. This thing went in the chat as obscurity, was a terrible product, but designed a bunch of the UI and like icons and stuff, and at that point I was like, okay, I'm ready to like drop out for good. Like, I can do this on my own and just make money that way. And that was it. School was over for me. And it was a good moment because a certain device got introduced, and interest in designing software would soon completely skyrocket, especially within the Mac developer scene, because obviously if you had a Mac, you wanted to make iPhone apps now. After a year, the App Store came out, and I started working with developers to make apps. This was one of the ones I designed with David Lanham. It's an incredibly talented designer. It was the first one, as far as I know, that actually has the page flipping animation. Not the kind of cool core image kernel stuff we have nowadays. This used like a PNG array of 14 PNGs that were rendered in a 3D program, and we just horizontally transformed the text to flip it over to the next page. But it was cool, and we used Gutenberg collection books with custom designed covers, and it did super well. It was even in an Apple ad at some point. But I worked with a lot of different developers to like design little utilities and stuff. Super fun work. And, you know, apart from the indie work, I kind of sold out. Like, I started working for the big companies, and that became sort of the main income for me. But what I never stopped doing, funny enough, was designing icons, just for fun, for the hell of it. I always kept motivating myself to make little one-off icon sets, whether it was based on a particular thing, a theme, maybe an app whose icon I didn't like that much. It was always kind of trying to keep the fun in it, and what that self-motivated work that brought me into designing in the first place. And that is like a really big founding principle that I keep in the back of my mind all the time, is reminding myself why I love what I do. And it's really important if you came into something because of a passion, and a lot of us here no doubt have this with programming. You started doing it because you wanted to figure out how something worked. You wanted to tear it apart, and then you could make it do what you wanted it to do. That is the kind of thing you have to keep in your life, right? You have to keep these self-motivated projects going, because otherwise it's very easy for it to just become like a job and something you look forward to just not doing anymore. Failure number 2 was Apple. I worked at Apple for a while. It looks really fun with the discount treatment, doesn't it? Like, doesn't look very on-brand. Apple legal, please don't heed that. I worked at MobileMe during a very, very turbulent time. Now, some people here might remember MobileMe. Back in the day, iCloud wasn't free. Apple charged money for it. And you might say, oh, it must have worked a little better back then. Think again. It didn't work very well. In fact, MobileMe was so famous for melting down that at this period at Apple, like if you walk the hallways of Apple HQ, Steve would famously like ask you if you worked on Mobile Me or not, and if you did, he would just completely burn you down verbally, and people would walk into the office a shell of themselves. It was pretty bad. Going into Apple, I had this weird feeling, this sort of concept of failure. To me, failure was I make a design or make anything, and if I throw it away, if it's discarded, that's failing. Pretty normal assumption, right? I mean, if you make something and you have to throw it away, you're not a big fan of it. Definitely doesn't feel good. But Apple actually made me rethink that, kind of what failing was, because their process was so entirely different from anything I'd ever done before. See, when I work with clients, and I kind of still do, you have a certain process. In my case, the process was I made a couple sketches. Let's say you want an icon done. I do make a couple different sketched icons. And then the client says, oh, these are cool, maybe one or two. We pick those, we work on those, like make really nice detailed versions of them, and then the final one is like what I hand off, and it's like, that's a pixel perfect, beautiful icon. Cool, done. The same client designer model thing is going on at Apple. There's this one particularly difficult client. No names will be named, but everything has to be pixel perfect. So if I design something, it would be like that thing that I handed off at the last step. If they were like, okay, let's like look at 15 icons for Find My iPhone, all of them had to be perfect, pixel perfect, worked out until the smallest details, so that it could be sent to design review, evaluated, presented by, say, several senior VPs to the person in charge, and then you get very detailed feedback back in return for your design work. And it was rough. I would put all my work into these icons and be like, these are easily the best icons I've ever done. You know, you're super proud of them, you're happy, you're like, this will sail right through, because that was my experience. Like, I made them for clients, like, wow, cool, nice, yeah, this is totally it. And they would just keep getting rejected. And it reminded me, in a really visceral way, of this story I heard once. Someone once explained to me, like, my threshold for creativity is the bear challenge. The challenge is you have to draw a bear from memory, like just a representation of a bear. Maybe it'll look something like this the first time. And then someone says, make another one. Draw something, but don't base it on the previous drawing. Make a unique representation of a bear. After a set amount, could be 4, could be 10, maybe 20, you don't know how to make a new drawing of a bear anymore. You don't know how to represent it in a different way. That you're sort of banging your head against a wall, and that wall is sheer creativity. Like, that is making up an entirely new thing that doesn't draw from your collective memory of the impressions of bears you've seen in your life. You're making a completely new thing. That's kind of how Apple was sometimes. And it was rough. It felt really personal, because I was very personally invested in my work. I mean, I shared it online, and if someone was trash talking like the icons I made, it was like, hey, you know, what are you talking about? I was so invested in it that if I would make this work, especially after making that 6th bear, you know, that one that you're so proud of because you were sitting late at night, and you're like, I don't know how to do anymore. I don't know how to make a new icon for Find My iPhone. I somehow made something new, and I was like, oh yeah, this is definitely it. This is it. This is cool. This is really cool. And then you still got that feedback, and you're like, oh shit, I don't know what to do anymore. And that was also like, it kind of hits you personally, right? Your self-esteem is a little affected by it. You're like, fuck. I hope I can say that. Damn, this is like not good. So when people sometimes ask me like, hey, what was it like designing at Apple? I can either say, this is kind of an image that represents it. For some people who are like, that's a little abstract, I'm like, you're right, I should make a flow chart. Then I'm like, no, I'm at Pragma, this is a programmers conference, I have to speak their language. I'm not sure if the syntax here works, but that's a code example you can take home. That's the only code in my deck, by the way. Consider this a break. But it taught me something really valuable. Eventually, obviously, you end up with a final design. Often, not always, often Steve knew better than we did as designers. And I often had this thing before Apple where I designed something and I'm like, it's good, but it needs that little something. Like, I don't know what, but it needs like something. And it turns out sometimes that little something is just starting over. Sometimes you just got to throw it out and do it again, because all the lessons you learned by making it the first time will stick with you, and you might actually make it a lot better than it was your first time around. Difficult, but a good lesson. And you're not your work. Like, you can let it go. It's okay. It's time. Yes, it sucks sometimes, but it's all right. Let it go. Just zen out, move on, make something new. So my time at Apple was coming to a close. I worked with some of the most amazing people I will admire forever. It was really cool, and if anyone at Apple will tell you, if you don't work there for like 10 years, you'll still have something shipping by the time you leave a lot later, because it's a very slow-moving company. They do stuff way ahead of time, and then it ships later. And so my time for that was the iPhone 4S keynote when Eddie Q was announcing something. So let's see if the audio works.
Friends.
This one.
Well, today we're announcing a new app called Find My Friends.
I was like, cool, I worked on that.
And when you launch it, you see a list of your family and friends that are sharing their location with you.
Anyone here still use Find My Friends?
So now when I'm in Disneyland, for example, I can easily see
it's a pretty decent
who
amount.
my family
Nice,
is.
nice. So Find My Friends came out, and I was really, really pleased because, you know, hey, we've been working on this for a long time, and trust me, this is one of those cases where we have to keep drawing new bears, if you know what I mean. Steve did not like the idea of a social app at all, so eventually, very long story how we ended up with this design. And I was like, cool, it's out now, nice. I may have not agreed with all the design choices in it, but this is the way it was. And it soon would be everywhere, not in the sense that people would be using it all the time, which they did, but it would also come on websites all the time. Suddenly headlines were coming out. I'm like, why is Apple making everything look like an ugly Wild West? Will Apple's tacky software design philosophy cause a revolt? Fake leather specifically named. Joni Ive becomes Apple's chief of all human interface. Could mean no more stitched leather in iOS. They said it in a hopeful tone. And this is my favorite, the Quora question, if you search for it. What does stitched leather have to do with finding my friends? You can almost read the frustration through it. And the best part is, of course, Emma here, who replies, my answer, nothing. Nothing. Very sharp, Emma. Good observation. Nothing. Ugly. Tacky. Not related to me in any kind of way. And, you know, it can get you down a little bit. It's like, you look at these things and you're like, oh, this doesn't feel great. But surprisingly, it actually didn't affect me as much as it would. Why? Because, yeah, you can say, oh, that was such a failure. Obviously, everybody hated it. For one, I don't think everybody really hated it. I was happy that it actually went out the door. There's a long story behind the design, which I'm sure I can cover at some other point in time. But that big lesson I learned helped massively during the design process. You're not what you make. It was out there. The design was out there. We'd worked on it with other people. This is the way we went through the process. This is what we created. This is me. It's my work. It's fine for people to criticize it. I can laugh about it very, very much. I love it. Especially some people who like really latch onto it as something that was actually really good. And like, it was stitched leather. It was like whatever. It was a good lesson that you're not your work. And moving beyond it. It makes you a much better person because you're much more open to critique that way as well. Besides, you know, it's not like your work is tied to you forever or anything. Yeah. Last one, procrastination was going to fix all this, didn't do it. I love Reddit. Does anyone here use Reddit? Reddit is a really good website for procrastinating on. So Reddit has communities, like a community for Italy, a community for video games like PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds, for Star Wars, for birds with arms. That's one for birds with arms. 86,000 people who share pictures of birds with arms. Let me tell you, it is a world out there of birds with arms. And I'm talking lots of excellent birds with arms. Thousands of people work hard to bring these birds with arms, and there is a community around it. I love Reddit. So at some point in time in the past, we'll call it the birds with arms era of my life, I was using this particular app a lot. I was on Reddit a lot. I was also using this particular app a lot. I was not a big fan of this app. It didn't look very good. So I contacted the people who made the app, and I was like, this is a really good experience, end to end. It's lots of fun. It's really satisfying. It was kind of like the first time you use Amazon Prime, and you get something to show up 2 days later. You're like, wow, awesome. Instant satisfaction. The app was kind of crap. It looked like this. It was like a small app. You could get you a town car. It was so much better than taxis because the town car would show up, and then it was like GPS tracking. It was neat. It was a small company called Uber. So I got the intro. My friend actually got me the email, and I met up with the CEO, and I went to their office. This was their logo at the time. Super swank. It was just a really small early-stage startup, and they brought me in and was like, oh, this is really cool. I made a few mock-ups for them, and I was like, this could definitely look a lot better. They were like, we agree. And we're actually working on this crazy project where people can use their own cars, and it'll be like cheaper and different. Maybe we'll make it a different app, or maybe we'll roll it into one. Anyway, we need design help. clearly. And I was like, sure, okay. And they were like, when can you start? And I was like, I got to think about this for a little bit. So I went home, thought about it, reflected on it. I was like, nah, limos are lame. Let's see what's going on Reddit. So this is one thing that was going on at the time. It's a man in a cat suit, crypt full of cats. What was happening? Oh, dude, they're freaking out. Oh, whoa. That's great. I love that video. So you're like, it sounds kind of dumb, Sebastian. That's actually because it was. It was really stupid. I never emailed them back. I actually never did. I got an email from them. They were like, hey, can you come work with us? Can be contract full-time, whatever. I never got back to them. I was procrastinating a lot at the time. But one valuable thing I learned when I started my design company was how important it is to kind of speak the language of a community. So in the case of Reddit, I made this like exercise where I was like, I'm going to pretend Pokemon are logos and design brands around them. And knowing how Reddit share things and like how to appreciate sharing things candidly, opening a dialogue, and not being too promotional was one of the things that I only knew because I was part of Reddit and like kind of frequented it so much. So I posted it on Reddit. It really took off. I talked back to people. Like I chatted a lot with people in the comments, and they really appreciated that. And that way you kind of create lasting friendships, not deep friendships, but people who will consider you like a pretty good person that is not too self-promotional online. And if Reddit picks it up, other websites will too, because they like have journalists that have quotas to make, so if something goes very viral on Reddit, it's probably a good indication for their metrics being good. In fact, this went everywhere, which got me a lot of business, but I also once had this crazy motorcycle ride, and it blew up. Like it went, like it's one of the top posts of all time on Reddit. It got millions and millions of views, and that made me realize is, okay, sharing something is cool, but to this day I get messages that relate to this, and some of them are, more eloquent than others. Like the "I will marry you so damn hard" was pretty funny, but some of them are literally people who were depressed or like were really stuck in a rut or didn't know how to fix their life, and I still get messages from people say like, "Man, your post really helped me change my life for the better." And I never realized that was possible, that I could do something like that I could also effectuate positive change in someone's life. I thought I was just sharing a few cool photos or a good story. But you too can share something which you don't know is so useful to other people. So beside that, it helped me turn the side project into something a bit more commercial. And birds with arms are the thing I can thank for it, right? Like, hey, such bros, that's great. Sharing and talking about your work is a really important part of your work. And it's risky because you open yourself up, right? It kind of feels like you're very exposed. And when people say, like, oh, great design is taking risks, it's such a platitude. It's like, oh, I'm going to pick a different font, and everybody's going to be like, that's the wrong font. I'm taking a risk. It's not like that. It's really putting yourself out there. It's trying to defend something which you know might not go so well, or maybe plugging yourself into the community so you are open to critique. Taking risk is really important. So was this a failure? Yeah. Uber is a $17 billion company now. could have been on my CV. No, those are some failures, but in the end, like I learned a lot from them, right? So those are very formative experiences for me. So let's flip it around again. I'll talk about success. A few months ago, me and my friend Ben, who's here, he'll be talking tomorrow, made this app called Halide. Halide is a iPhone camera app, and it's different than the stock camera app in the sense that it lets you customize like shutter speed, exposure, white balance, ISO, offers a kind of a unique gestural interface, lets you shoot in RAW, like it has a few unique qualities of its own. When we first started working on this, and I told people I was working on a camera app, this was the general response. They're like, why? There's so many camera apps in the App Store. So most of them are free. There's already so many out there. There's like no need to do this anymore. And that's a pretty good point. And so people ask like, how does this all get started? Well, Ben sent me a message once, and it was after WWDC 2016, if I recall correctly. They were announcing these APIs to work with the camera, and you can set some new settings and stuff, and I was not too on the fence on it when he asked me like, hey, do you want to build a camera app? I was like, yeah, I'll totally build a camera app with you, because I thought there was this problem with cameras. Cameras are this, right? They're a beautiful thing that you take photos with, and we have one of those. It's in our pocket. It's our iPhone. They're great. Really good cameras, getting better every year, and you always have it with you. So what's the problem? Why are people still buying cameras that are not iPhones? Twofold, right? There's a physical problem. Lenses are big. There's a physical reason lenses are big. We cannot get around that very easily. There's technical solutions for this, but sensor size and lens stuff, I can't design my way out of that. So that's just a thing that will always exist. But there's another reason people own cameras, because there's small cameras that have, you know, not that much better of an image quality than your standard iPhone, and not that much bigger of a lens, but people still use them. Why do they use them? The reason are these controls. So if you look at them here, these things, they're tactile. It feels really good to use. In fact, they're tactile in such a way that a lot of good photographers describe that their camera becomes an extension of themselves. You don't have to think about it. It's just in your fingers. And so you manipulate light and take photos as if it is an extension of your own eye. And the iPhone camera doesn't quite work like that. So I thought, can I bring that to a camera app? Can it work like that? Maybe. Let's see what's out there first. What kind of camera apps exist? There's two kinds of camera apps. Simple ones, complex ones. The simple one, you're all familiar with. It's in your pocket. It's this one. This is the iPhone camera app. This is a brilliant camera. It's one of the most popular ones, if not the most popular camera on Earth. The iPhone camera works in the following principle. I point it at something, and it'll show me what the photo will look like before I even take it. Amazing. You move it around, it will always optimize for what it's looking at. If there is a slightly different kind of intent, you can tap it. This one tap will give a point of intent that says, I want this to be in focus and or exposed correctly. Hopefully both. The camera will then attempt to figure out if it can make that work for you. So you kind of work with this camera. The problem with this one tap input is when it doesn't work. It's kind of like Clippy. I see you're trying to take a photo of a flower. Would you like that sharp or well exposed? And you end up feeling kind of like these people who are trying to kind of like work with this phone. You feel detached from it. It feels frustrating. There's a communication barrier between you and the phone that is trying to take a picture. You know what you want, but the phone damn doesn't. And I cannot overstate how brilliant this user interface is. The tap to focus thing, they patented it to hell. It's brilliant. It's the greatest innovation in photography in a long time. It's direct manipulation of a camera. No other camera offered that. Smartphone cameras are crazy, but that's the simple approach. That's done. We all have it. For most people, that's what a camera is nowadays. Okay, so there's complex, right? The other sort of way. Here's a screenshot of a current camera app for iPhone with pro settings. Actually, this is not a screenshot. You might be fooled, but this is actually an A350 cockpit. Almost the same in complexity, many button sliders, etc. Complexity is great. It affords you affordances to communicate your will to do what you want to do with it. But the complexity can be overwhelming, and in fact, if you don't understand the problem or understand the complexity of it, it's overwhelming to the point of not being able to understand what's going on. It reminded me of CSSEDIT. Now, my little basic code example at first betrays my inability to code. I am really extremely bad at programming anything. Your talks all sound like wizardry to me. This app changed my life because CSSEDIT, which is now defunct, who was part of MacRabbit, helped me change my CSS in a way that suddenly I got what CSS was. Because if I changed the margin on something or changed the color or whatever, I could see that this element changes color immediately, and it gave me a grip of like, oh, this is how CSS works. I can go quickly break stuff, and I can see how it reflows. I can see how float works, etc. So what it did is it brought a simple UI to a complex problem. And when you do that, it's transformative. There's a name for it. The word for that is, oh man, suspense is killing me. The word is teaching. Here we go again. Boom. The word is teaching. You basically create a simple UI to grasp a complex problem, and through that, someone can learn how it works. It's like a lever for their intellect on a complex problem. So I was like, can we make something like that? Can we make a teaching camera? Can we take the cockpit, stick a steering wheel on it, fade out the complexity a little bit? Can we create a UI that kind of gets out of your way, still has a lot of the complexity, still has a lot of that functionality that you want so you can communicate your intent, but can we make it so it slowly relays itself to the user and makes itself very evident? Sure, so let's look at the problem. We have a one-dimensional user interface. How can we make that more complex, or at least allow it to communicate our intentions a little better? Well, we can only look at history. Photography is very old. It has very many solved problems. You can look at 100 years worth of problems that photography has solved. One of them is control. Photography used to be this crazy thing. It took chemistry lessons and hundreds of hours of work to get a single image. In the 60s, that was over. We had kind of figured out standard controls. So let's take the camera, put it in your hands. This is what you see. there's two cardinal directions here at work. Super simple. These are canonical. Every engineer knows that standards are wonderful because there are just so many of them. Around the world, there is one standard with cameras that is always the same. It's how you operate it. You move this left and right. If you move it to the right, it focuses far away. You move it to the left, it focuses close. This thing, often circular, but if you do adjust exposure in a compensation kind of way, up means brighter, down means darker. Super simple concepts. So we could make a two-dimensional interface for our camera. Swipe up and down on the screen to make it lighter or darker, and immediately see your exposure changes in real time. And the same thing applies to focus. Create the horizontal standard of going left and right to focus close or far. And you can over-scroll it to simply go back to autofocus. If you scroll all the way to the right again, it'll just go into autofocus. You don't have to worry about it anymore. And of course, you can still tap. If you want to tap, you can tap. That's fine. But in this way, people can totally communicate their intentions a lot closer, and it conforms to their expectation patterns on how a camera would work. This is kind of how it looks in action. You can see you just sort of swipe back and forth. You see focus. Well, focus looks good. Instantly swipe up and down. And it's funny how fast it becomes muscle memory. Like that earlier camera, it can become kind of an extension of yourself. So we make sure that these controls are always manipulatable. They're never non-interactive. There's no mode, there's no hunting for like a slider where it is. How do we call this approach? I don't know. Kind of both, simple, complex. But it wasn't quite done with that. I was like, okay, so we got the manipulation down and like I can communicate my point, but why the camera is still so fun? Because like you can give them to a child and they'll take 2 seconds to figure out the most engaging thing of the camera. It's the little knobs and like the buttons and stuff. We love clicking like buttons and tweaking knobs. It's just too much fun. It's just way too much fun. And cameras are just stupidly tactile like that. That makes them so fun. And that became sort of the founding principle of the design. It's very important to have a principle you found a design on. In this case, it was make it stupidly tactile. What can we make really tactile? The shutter button. How can we make that even more satisfying to click? Because it's this dead glass thing you tap on. You can make it play a sound. Doesn't really do it for me. So we made it so it kind of looks like you can fit the notch of your finger into it. Like it almost invites you to tap it. And it has this thoroughly prototyped particular springing action if you press it, which Apple now also is bringing to the new versions of iOS. And so we went back and forth on that, and Ben was like, oh God, this guy with different timings for how the button is going to work. I was like, Ben, what about all the buttons? What if we make all the buttons feel really good? So we went and prototyped that as well, and I was like, oh God, this guy, I'm going to kill myself. So these buttons, you push them in a little bit, they physically move back a little, creates a bit of touch feedback. What about cameras? When you set them up for the first time, you get your camera, you unpack it, you have like a little manual, right? Like you go through the booklet and see how it works. Maybe we can do that. We can totally, like the first time you open Halide, this is what you get. Here's the Halide camera application manual. There's a little leafy thing over there, and if you move that, sure enough, you can leaf through your manual, and it tells you how to use the camera really quick. It's just not a full book, mind you. It's just a couple pages, and this last page asks you to give some permissions. You know, once you get locked into a founding principle, the tendency is to push it as far as you can. So before we actually shipped, the last most ridiculous thing we did to make it more tactile and more like a real camera was literally commission an entire custom typeface by my friend, which is based on how lens barrels look and how cameras look. Cameras look that way, and a typography element looks that way because you etch into it with a small round router bit. It gets engraved like that, which means the type has a certain round look to it. So all the icons and user interface elements and stuff in the typography was sort of measured to look like that and uses like consistent design system between that. And that's how we built Halide. Of course, there's all this like technological stuff as well that Ben, he's going to talk about a lot of that tomorrow. But I have no idea about how it works. Lots of way more magic. Believe me that. But that became Halide. Halide is opinionated. It was our way of doing it, and it's not for everyone. That's fine. But we did it because we loved doing what we did. It was our passion project. We did it in our spare time because it reminded us of those things we did when we were younger, where we were self-motivated to create something simply because we loved doing that. Make something stupidly tactile, make something new and cool and shiny. We knew that even if it came out and people hated it, we were scratching our own itch. This is our camera app, fine, maybe it won't do well. We didn't know if it was going to do well at all. We just put it out there. It doesn't matter if people don't like it, because we are not the work that we made. It's simply our work. It's out there now. And we took that risk. We charged for a camera app on the App Store in this day and age. We put it out there. And thankfully, because of hard work and a lot of luck, it did really well. And it was a total success. We were really, really humbled to see the reception to it. It was really, really cool. We got an image on Daring Fireball. Bucket list challenge complete. And it was very, very cool to see that as you create a tool for people to create stuff with, you get all this creative stuff back. People make images and shoot photos with it, and it's like, wow, cool. Really, really satisfying. And now, of course, there's the next chapter, and maybe we'll make an update and see what gets received for crazy new hardware and that kind of stuff, but that was a success because of a lot of reasons. So I wish you all great success in the future. I also wish you many failures that are super interesting and make fun stories at conferences. And there's one last thing I want to show you. Do I have time? Am I okay? Okay. Just a second. That useless stuff I made, right, when I was a stoner kid, I worked for HP for a bit and made that touchscreen computer. Yeah. They
3, 4, 2,
came somewhere.
2.
This is the computer, by the way. It was not a success. I wonder why. Anyway, towards the end of this thing was shipping. It was like weeks away. They had to get the GM in there, and they suddenly contact me and say, there's this thing you do in this thing where you browse songs. You need an icon for browsing songs. On the icon, we already know what the icon's going to be. It's going to be a bunch of albums and a little fan. But we can't use album art. Album art is copyrighted. So, yeah, it looks like this. Let's stop it there. We'll zoom and enhance. Do you have some artwork lying around that we can use just like a throwaway like album art? And I was like, I think I got some stuff you could use. If I had told like my 15-year-old self that, like it would have blown his mind. Anyway, I'm Sebastiaan. Thank you so much for having me.